I do now, sorry.
Yeah, good. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rudy Shankar. I'm the director of the Energy Systems Engineering program at Lehigh University, and we're kicking off the spring seminar series. We just concluded last month our fall seminar series, where the topic was all about the energy transition. What was being done in different parts of the globe. We looked at Uruguay. We looked at what we were doing in the U.S. What's happening elsewhere in Asia. And, this semester, we're going to look at, what are some of the realities we're facing on the ground. And I can't think of a more appropriate speaker and a topic than today's. CAROLYN Kissaane is with, let's see, I'm sorry. She's with New York, NYU Center for Global Affairs, right? So let me just read the first two sentences of our abstract. The prevailing concept of an energy transition, the shift from fossil fuels to renewables, is increasingly misaligned with global energy realities. While it aligns with climate goals, it fails to account for persistent and growing fossil fuel dependence, particularly in developing economies where energy demand continues to surge. So really, that pretty much summarizes what you'll be hearing today and the other seminars in the series this spring. So CAROLYN comes from, she's a globally recognized authority on energy geopolitics, and she reminded me that her specialty is geopolitics, and anything that has to do with science, she's going to hand it over to me. I don't know how I'm going to fare. She's and energy geopolitics, climate security, and the dynamics of global energy transitions. As an associate dean of the graduate programs in global affairs and global security, conflict, and cybercrime at NYU Center for Global Affairs, she also serves as a clinical professor teaching courses on the geopolitics of energy, resource activity, and climate change. Her work bridges academia, policy, and industry, offering a sophisticated understanding of energy's role in global affairs. Dr. Kissaane is the founding director of NYU's SPS Energy Climate Justice and Sustainability Lab and coordinator of the Energy and Environment Concentration. Recognized as one of Breaking Energy's top 10 New York women in energy, Dr. Kissaane is also on the boards of New York Energy Forum and New York Energy Week. And that was held recently, I believe. A recipient of NYU's Excellence in Teaching Award, she's been celebrated for her innovative and impactful teaching. With a PhD from Columbia University, she is a sought-after voice in global energy debates, known for her strategic insights and thought-provoking commentary. Well, welcome, CAROLYN. And again, just show, if the audience could wait for her to finish her talk to ask your questions. I'm assuming that you're okay with that, CAROLYN. And towards the end, they can ask the questions. So, CAROLYN, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shankar, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you this afternoon. I'm really delighted and feel very honored. And to all of you joining, thank you for taking the time. And I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a very dynamic conversation. I do look forward to the interactions that we'll have together. I will tell you what I tell my students, that I enjoy being challenged. This is actually meant to be, a provocative sort of putting forward an idea that is, there's clearly some, you could call it contention or disagreement in terms of where we are in the energy transition. The piece that I recently wrote that was published in Project Syndicate in early December is sort of serves as the kind of what will serve as the kind of focus for today's talk. I'll just put it up so you can see. This is a piece that I wrote with Dr. Richard Haass, who is the President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. And we wrote it in December, after many conversations that I'm a lifetime member of the council. I've done a lot of events for them specific to climate change, energy transition. And this piece kind of came out of conversations that he and I were having about the energy transition. And kind of this idea of this intellectual framework, in some ways, I believe, and we sort of took this on in this piece to sort of challenge this notion that we are in what is referred to as a transition. Now, I don't discount there's extraordinary change taking place across energy systems. The premise of this piece was specific to this phasing out, moving away from fossil fuels. So it's not to discount the many energy additions that are taking place. And I think if you read the BP Energy Outlook for 2024, that was something that they really sort of highlighted, that we are not yet in a place of subtraction, but we are adding more to our overall sort of energy kind of portfolio of energy sources, but we're not seeing subtraction. And I think that that's important. I should just add, I spent a lot of time in the, what we call the former Soviet Union, in the early 90s, where we and I, talked a lot about this idea of political transition and how, countries were thought to be, and many were, some did not prove to be successful in their transition, a transition of a movement away from one political system to another. The idea that there was going to be this sort of linear transition from communism in some countries to democracy. And again, in some places that did happen, in other places that there were many hiccups, and in some ways a retreat back to older systems. So that was kind of part of the thread of this piece. And so what I'd like to do today is just to kind of talk to you about, why I think we need to kind of move into a narrative that is more framed around coexistence. One, because I think it is more accurately captures today's sort of global energy mix. And also because I think it is also a way to bring more people into the conversation, because it is less about exclusionary types of approaches to talking about energy. And again, I think here in the United States, we of course, are seeing in some ways maybe more of the extreme right now with the new Trump administration. I'll talk a little bit about this idea of energy dominance. But in some ways, I also want to make it clear that it is not a position of advocacy for not addressing the need to bring down global carbon emissions, and to do so in a smart way. I do think that some of the things that are coming out of the new U.S. administration are very problematic. But I also want to kind of think how we can think about this idea of energy coexistence in a way that I think will be overall more helpful. I'm going to share with you very quickly. I'm going to just stop the share real quick. I'm going to share with you a very, very short video. And I'm sharing with you this video for two reasons. One, I think it is particularly kind of useful for what I encourage my students to sort of think beyond what they are told to see. Okay, so it's a short, very short video. It has nothing to do with energy, so I'll put that straight out there. But I hope that it will sort of start to kind of spur some different thinking. And some of you may have actually already seen this video. It's from 2008. Okay, I'm gonna quickly put this on.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So it's easy to miss something you're not looking for, is the, you know, and so before I kind of go into my more formal presentation, I share that because in some ways I think the emphasis on this idea that we are in this energy transition and that we're moving away from fossil fuels in some ways was sort of not looking at a lot of the data, and what we are seeing. In fact, we are seeing, year on year growth in coal consumption. We are seeing, year on year growth in oil consumption. Now, that's not to say that this is into perpetuity, right? But we have been seeing, year on year increases. We're seeing increases in natural gas consumption. Now, if you go back 10 years, you could clearly find some analysis and forecasts that suggested that the world was moving towards peak coal demand and that we are going to see peak oil demand before 2030. That's an interesting debate. I hope that we'll sort of talk about that. And then we're also going to see kind of a move towards transitioning away from even natural gas. I would argue that that the realities that we're seeing is that for different reasons, we are seeing more coal demand. We are going to be seeing much more natural gas demand in the years ahead, and at least for the next few years, we do anticipate that we'll see more oil demand. Now, again, I would also throw in that I think what's happening in China is a sort of a big kind of area to be looking at in terms of how they're changing their fuel demand picture, which could have tremendous implications even outside of China in terms of the export of their technologies and also electric vehicles. But I would still argue that coal and natural gas will continue to see kind of an uptick in overall global demand in the years forthcoming. And some of that, again, is kind of caught analysts off guard, right? Because of this kind of idea that we were moving away, or that we would eventually start to move away, and we would see a downturn in demand. But even things like cooling and expanded demand on cooling systems because of extreme heat. So it seems like paradoxical that we would be seeing higher cooling demand causing higher coal consumption in as we sort of confront the implications and the impacts of climate change. And I know I probably don't need to tell anyone here that in addition to the year-on-year growth in fossil fuel demand, we're seeing a year-on-year sort of record heat and record temperatures. And part of this is sort of driving some of this demand that we are seeing, and some of where we, I think, anticipated displacement. So displacement of fossil fuels, for example, coal, even, again, natural gas. Some of that displacement has been disrupted by climate change, by more extreme heat. We are seeing in some regions of the world where they are losing hydropower capacity, or hydropower generation is much more volatile than it was. And what makes up for that volatility? Where does that sort of short change in the capacity, where does it come from? And for example, in China, you have seen that when they have a shortfall in hydropower, that they'll make up for it with coal. It's not the only part of the world where we are seeing that. So I think with all of that sort of put on the table, I just like to sort of, put out that sort of provocative idea that we are in fact transitioning away. And if you go back to COP28, that was in the kind of a key outcome of the COP28 agreement, was that the world was going to transition away from fossil fuels, that there was going to be a commitment to phasing out. In COP29, that was taken out of the final agreement. Much of that came from Saudi Arabia. However, we don't really have to look very far from our own borders to see what has happened in the United States, right? Here in the United States, we are the world's largest producer of oil and the largest producer of natural gas. We are producing 13.5 million barrels of oil a day. If you include gas liquids, we're almost up to 20 million barrels a day. So the United States has become a prolific power in the production of oil and natural gas. We also have some of the highest reserves of coal. We have seen a reduction in our own coal consumption, but much of that, again, has been driven by an abundant amount of natural gas, as well as cheap natural gas. So again, all of these things to say that, even though there's been a push to reduce fossil fuels, you are seeing, again, in many different parts of the world, you're not seeing a real sort of shift in the demand picture. And where that sort of inflection point will be, in terms of where you do see that we do hit the peaks on all three. Again, coal, natural gas, and coal, they're not going to happen simultaneously. But I think there is an important question as to, how we see those peaks. And again, if we just take coal as an example, there was an idea that we had peaked, but that has been challenged by today's data. The data today shows globally that coal demand continues to go up. It continues to go up in parts of the world that are also seeking greater energy access. They are seeing, one of the things that you see is that you don't have middle, high income countries and low energy capacity. So when you're thinking about also economic growth and the associated inputs of economic growth, I think it's important that without the adequate funding, without the adequate, access to alternatives to fossil fuels, I think we'll continue to see the demand picture show that we are not yet at a place where we are transitioning away from, but we are I would say that we are in a kind of a, there are some people that I have conversations with talk about it as more of an energy evolution, or a perpetual energy transition that we've had, and that we can be transitioning, adding more renewable energy technologies. Of course, just, the last few years, seeing record solar deployment, We're seeing more wind deployment, again, notwithstanding some of the challenges here currently in the United States, much more long-term, longer duration battery storage, advanced geothermal. There's a lot of things that are at play that we are, sort of seeing being added to, but it's being added to along with the additions to fossil energies. So again, that's kind of the big point that I highlight, is that we can't yet adequately or accurately say that we are transitioning away from fossil energy and hydrocarbons. So I'm going to share just a couple of slides I'd love to show you, and I'll bring this up. And since I mean, Lehigh University, I'm sitting here at NYU, would like to kind of take us into the United States kind of as this interesting example of this coexistence, because I think the United States in many ways kind of highlights how we are in this period of coexistence. And again, one of the, President Trump is using this term energy dominance, is something that he brought into play in 2016, and then in 2017 was on his on the White House website. He's brought it back, dominance 2.0. I think the United States has always had a interesting relationship with energy, starting with President Nixon after the Arab oil embargo, this idea that the United States would get to a place of being energy independent, that we could be independent, again, to sort of release some of the insecurities associated with high import dependencies. The United States has come a long way, right, since the 1970s. Even going back to 2008, one of the things that I tell my students is that it's hard to imagine a period where you actually had almost bipartisan agreement on energy. But in 2008, when it looked like the United States was actually really going to struggle with import dependency, both on natural gas and on oil, you had candidate McCain and candidate Obama having very similar political platforms around renewable energy. Of course, much of that got upended with the technologies that came out of hydraulic fracturing and fracking. So this has also created greater efficiencies in our own U.S. oil and gas production, but it's also created much more supply, which has kind of changed, I think, the overall global shift. I think a counterfactual, which I always like to sort of work with counterfactuals, if the United States in 2008, right? In 2008, you have to remember, we were building, and this is really hard to imagine. So for some of you who are, younger, you may not remember, but in 2008, the United States was building an import terminal for liquefied natural gas. So we were short on natural gas. We needed to import. The plan was to import natural gas, liquefied natural gas from Qatar. We were building, Cheniere was building an LNG terminal to buy LNG. Because of fracking, that LNG terminal was reconfigured to be an export terminal. And now what do we have in the United States, right? We have many export terminals. We are looking at even more. The United States took over from Qatar in 2023 as the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. So Qatar has more natural gas. They are, because of their northern field, that they are going to be bringing into the market. United States has more natural gas that they'll be bringing online in the next through 2028. So we're going to be seeing, and we're seeing more takers for LNG that is sort of being used in the mix. So I think there's kind of a lot of things. But going back to my counterfactual, I think the counterfactual that is if the United States had not had the access to the technologies that opened up fracking, that opened up what were dead wells, that were sort of, the United States had peaked. We had peaked our supply for both oil and natural gas. Okay. And that all got upended with fracking technology. And that fracking technology then, took the United States from being what was at that time forecasted to be that we were going to be a very large importer of LNG, that we were going to have to increase our imports of oil, that all changed, right? And so today, again, we sit as the largest oil and natural gas producers in the world by, I mean, just to put it into context, is the United States, just the state of Texas alone produces more than 3/4 of the countries that comprise of OPEC. Would have been hard to have imagined that, right? Going back 20 years ago, it would have been kind of unfathomable to even sort of reconcile how that could happen in the United States. But I think it has, in effect, U.S. has a role in also upending the energy transition as we have talked about it. So I'm going to just share with you a couple of slides here. Sorry, I'm getting some. So this is where I think it's really interesting to sort of think about coexistence. Now, again, I do also want to highlight that there's a lot of uncertainty right now with the Trump administration and the pauses that are in place, the pause on the IRA, the what looks to be some very exclusionary policies towards, for example, wind, still question marks about solar. But this, what this is going to mean for the United States, as also U.S. leadership in clean energy technology, I think is something that hopefully we'll have some time to discuss. But I think what's also important about the IRA, and I'm sure in your conversations in the fall when you were talking about the energy transition, you talked a lot about the IRA. But I think something that the IRA really sought to do was to say, okay, the United States has built tremendous strength in its hydrocarbon production. We have fallen behind, and we falling very significantly behind China. In 2008, Germany and Japan were the two largest manufacturers of solar panels. That is not the case today. China is by far the largest manufacturer of solar panels, wind turbines. They're the largest supplier of ships that can transport these massively large wind turbines. They are 5 to 10 years ahead on many battery technologies. And they have, in a very short period of time, they have really become a leader in electric vehicles. And they, have done so at price points that are incredibly competitive, but also make it very, very hard for countries such as the United States, Germany, and other countries that have had very sort of powerful auto industries to compete. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing, you're seeing high tariffs in the United States, 100% tariffs on EVs from China, but you're seeing similar tariffs in across Europe, and part of that is to protect domestic industries and to also spur more both innovation and to spur the kind of what is called kind of green industrialization. So if, one of the things I think you can see from a national security perspective, and again, much of my work sort of sits kind of in thinking about security, and I think a kind of in the footnotes of the IRA is that this is also was meant to really catapult the United States into being much more competitive on renewable energy technologies. So to stimulate domestic energy production, manufacturing in the energy sector, and really to bring focus and investments into the into U.S. projects. And again, the United States, was not a leader in clean energy technology, a leader in many things. However, China, partially because of its own insecurities, its own energy insecurity, because again, China is a big taker, the largest importer of oil, the largest importer of liquefied natural gas. That creates vulnerabilities in China. So there was a lot of motivation for China to develop to become what Amy Jaffe, who was at Tufts when she wrote this, the green giant. So in 2018, you really see that, China has really sort of is the sort of the global leader. And there was both a national security impetus for this, but there was also an geoeconomic security impetus to do this. And again, the IRA, in addition to sort of building and supporting in kind of a green industrial base in the United States, but also to reduce carbon emissions. So we see here, greener investments on electric vehicles, invest in heat pumps, rooftop solar, electric HVAC systems, water heaters, again, electric vehicles, wind and solar, and again, at the same time to reduce emissions. And what the IRA would mean for U.S. emissions when implemented. Again, this is really, again, so this this deck was designed about 3 weeks ago, and so things have changed since then. And what's important is, Trump's most current policies is to ban solar and wind, especially wind, on federal lands. Now, the question is, will this, after this 90-day pause in terms of looking at the IRA, what will it look like? However, you are sort of seeing a little bit of a kind of a switch from the anti-fossil, anti-hydrocarbon production on federal lands to now a anti-renewable energy production on federal lands. So we're going to see. So this is kind of a pretty striking total world share of natural gas production, because we are both a dry gas as well as a liquefied natural gas. So, we produce a lot. We're also using gas as a foreign policy tool. Since February of 2022, when, Russia invaded Ukraine, we have seen U.S. LNG go up quite significantly, especially our exports to Europe. We have seen even exports to Asia be rerouted to Europe. Europe is experiencing a colder than usual winter, so we're seeing a high demand for natural gas and for filling up storage that is coming up short in the due to the increasing demand that we're seeing. Now, again, working with counterfactuals, if you just look at Germany. Okay, so this is where, in some ways, that video that I showed you with the dancing bear, it's always nice to kind of start a presentation on a light note, but also to say, like, oftentimes there are things that we just don't see because we're not looking for them, right? So in February of 2022, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we were expecting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to be fully open, that Russia would be exporting more gas to Europe. Germany was going to be a big recipient and beneficiary of that gas. Germany was moving forward with its plans to take the remainder of its nuclear power offline. Okay. Fast forward to 2025. Germany has FSRUs, which are floating storage units, to take liquefied natural gas from the United States and from Qatar. They are building a very large liquefaction plant. So they have had to reduce their dry gas imports from Russia, but they have dramatically increased the LNG that they take from the United States as well as from other countries. Unfathomable in January of 2022. We would never have imagined that you would have FSRUs or liquefaction plants in Germany. But again, new realities kind of forced Germany, and I would say that, a premature closure of their nuclear power plants. So they have seen sort of the costs of some of their targets to both reduce emissions and to reduce fossil consumption, whereas what was planned now has been very much upended by a very new and more challenging geopolitical environment. So you see here, just in terms of what it looks like, but the United States is a really, really large producer of natural gas. And so if you look at exports, the United States, this is just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense. This is LNG, this is liquefied natural gas, but I think if you were to put this for dry gas, you would see, again, continued increases in U.S. production. You are seeing, shifts in what in the import. So China right now has dampened the appetite for LNG, has been dampened. Some of that might change in the coming weeks because China has also had a relatively mild winter to date, although they're moving into kind of a cold week with the start of Lunar New Year, kind of raising a number of questions as to, how they're going to meet increased heating demand. Something really interesting that also Bloomberg published this morning on EVs in China is that the EV efficiency and the charging actually is sort of more challenged during this type of increased cold weather and temperature. So it's going to be interesting to sort of see how that plays out this coming week. And global crude oil production, again, this is from the EIA. And so what you've seen is, Russia's production today stands at, Russia is about 9 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia is just about 9 million barrels a day. But the United States is up to almost up to 13 million barrels a day, a little over 13 million barrels a day. So you've seen here in 2013 where we were just above 7, and today we are almost at 14. So we have doubled our oil production in the United States. And so this is just to kind of show you, and again, these slides will be available to you so you can look at them in greater detail. I think this idea that, you know, Trump has said he's going to sort of unleash U.S. oil and gas production. Any of you who follow U.S. oil and gas production in the United States, you know that it is not, the lever is not with the federal government. The lever is with, you know, these are private companies. They are not going to kind of just freely open up the taps if the market is not giving them the incentive to do so. And there was projected increases in oil production that was already sort of built in to kind of the plans among some of the U.S. majors. That is still sort of expected to go through, but this idea of like a massive increase is not forthcoming. Don't expect it, again, unless you see some very sort of changing market realities. And here, I think, is really, this to me is maybe part of the story of this coexistence. And I'll just focus here again. This is, I'm sure, something that you've all been thinking about. It's really hard to open up a newspaper. Of course, today the newspaper is about sort of China and it's AI. Developments coming out of China, which is also really rapidly, massively disrupting Wall Street right now, and some of the prices for Nvidia and for Meta, and you know, the kind of changing the economics and the capital expenditure sort of outlook. But data centers, again, take you back to that short video that I showed you that was from 2008, had nothing to do with energy. But again, if you go back 10 years, data centers really weren't kind of considered to be something that was, like, at least in everything that I was reading, I wasn't reading about data centers and electricity demand. It wasn't really kind of high on that sort of like list of things that were going to kind of shift the demand picture. Today, it's hard not to see here, at least here in the United States, how demand for electricity is being shifted dramatically upward. Again, I could share with you probably 10 different forecasts. If you look at JP Morgan, if you look at Goldman, if you look at BlackRock, you look at lots of different Rystad Energy and Rhodium Group that are sort of forecasting what the demand picture is going to look like. And part of this demand picture is being driven by the not just a data center or 2 data centers, but what these hyperscalers and these mega data centers, right? Imagine a 5 gigawatt data center, what this is going to do to the demand load and meeting that capacity. And this is also, I think, what is kind of disruptive to this idea of transition and this idea of a moving away from fossil fuels. Because if you're just following natural gas here in the United States, you are seeing that the volumes for natural gas fired power plants and the inputs for that are going way up. Right? So there's an expectation that you will see more natural gas demand, and you will also see natural it's not just natural gas, because there's also the incentive for Microsoft, for Google, the GAFAMs to build out and to use as much renewable energy as possible to meet their very ambitious clean energy and carbon reduction targets. But they're going to be doing it also with a lot of natural gas. And in some states, you are also going to start to see, and it's starting to happen, recommission coal-fired power plants to meet this new demand. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's going to be a complete like reopening or recommissioning, but the same way that we're seeing some recommissioning of nuclear power plants, we will see in certain places, and especially where there's less obstacles to that recommissioning, you will see in some cases kind of reopening of coal-fired power plants to meet this new demand, especially on the baseload side. So I think with electricity demand, you're just seeing kind of like a very much, and again, this is where, I kind of come down in the piece that I wrote with Richard Haas, is this idea of energy coexistence, is that, we're still in a place where we need all of the above, and we need all of the above partially to meet demands that were not sort of forecasted 10 or 15 years ago, but are, have disrupted those demand outlooks and demand forecasts. And that idea of that kind of the linear transition is proving to be much more complicated and complex. And that requires a kind of kind of a change in how we talk about that energy mix. And again, coexistence is, in our view, a kind of a term that captures both like where we are and where we will be in over the next, I would say, at least for the next 5 years. I won't give a full 10-year outlook, but even I don't know if you've read Daniel Yergin. So Daniel Yergin, who wrote The Prize, reached out to us because there's a piece coming out in Foreign Affairs about the multidimensional transition, and said that term coexistence was a smart one to be thinking about the world where we are now. And again, if you were also looking at geopolitical competition and data centers, and again, it's not just about the data centers, it's about the computational power and the capabilities that are housed within a data center. So AI, companies are going to build those data centers where they have ample access to reliable, ideally affordable, resilient energy. And that is going to be, it's going to be natural gas, it's going to be hydro, it's going to be solar, it's going to be basically a whole portfolio of different options. And again, it's not just about data centers, but it's also about, the world's move towards more electrification. And the ideal was that electrification would also mean reduced emissions, and I believe that it will reduce emissions, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be solely based on non-fossil energies that are moving increased demand for electrification. So as much as we will have more cleaner electrons, we will still have molecules that will be carbon emitting. So that is, I think I'll stop there. I do have a couple of other slides, but I think I've gone a little bit longer than maybe what I want to make sure that there's time for questions.
Oh, that's terrific, Carolyn. All right, so the questions I'd like to first of all have the questions that come from the students in the ESE and other students. So students, if you have a question, please unmute yourself, ask the question, introduce yourself, and ask Carolyn the question. And also, those of you who have some immediate questions, put it in the chat box and we'll go through that. So hopefully we can answer all the questions that are posed. Fascinating topic. Questions from the students. Unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Here's one in the chat box from Hamza. I just lost it. Yeah.
I see it, Rudy. Hamza is,
Okay.
one of our current ESE students. He's asking, how do these constantly changing dynamics of the global energy market and global geopolitics affect the lives of everyday common people here in the U.S.?
So Hamza, thank you. That's an excellent question. And I would say not just the everyday lives of people here in the United States, but also, around the world. And I think we sometimes forget we have energy poverty here in the United States, but there are a billion people globally who don't have reliable access to energy. And if you think about what access to electricity means, right? If you think about what it means for education, what do you think about it means for healthcare? If you don't have reliable electricity, reliable access to power, that's going to greatly diminish, you know, human development on many different levels. So here in the United States, I think one of the things that you do see is you see in terms of prices can be very destabilizing. And you look at different income groups, those on the lower scale spend a disproportionate amount of their income paying for energy, both in terms of how they pay for their, if they have to drive, but also in terms of electricity, what they pay monthly. And so, again, Trump has come out and said many things, but he has said he's promised that electricity prices would go down, people would be paying less for energy. I would argue if you were to have if he were to follow through on his threats of tariffs, for example, on Canada. Canada is the largest source of US imported oil. We also have a lot of energy trade, natural gas as well as electricity. So I sit here in New York. We get hydropower from Quebec. So if you were to see these tariffs put on Canada, that would actually disproportionately negatively impact the US household. The same thing, even the threats that were issued yesterday against Colombia. We are not only for agricultural exports from the United States, but also for imports from Colombia, in addition to energy. So those tariffs would actually do harm to the US consumer. So maybe Hamza, I think I'll just very quickly take you to, again, since I already did talk about February of 2022, which I think is, again, this is not to present a Eurocentric or a Western-centric view, but when you had, February 24th, 2022, those months immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine meant very, very high prices for heating, for the price of energy across Europe went up quite significantly, really harming the consumer. And it didn't just harm the consumer. And I think if you look at Germany as a case in point, you had high prices that were and you did have government subsidies that tried to cushion the consumer and to cushion industry, but it couldn't cushion completely. So you definitely saw hits to the consumer, and you have not seen I think German industry and much of European industry has been hit quite significantly by the higher energy prices. You've had a lot of volatility. Something that's really interesting when you look at liquefied natural gas, there are kind of three prices for LNG. We have a price here in the United States, kind of North America, European, and then Asian prices. And European prices have been very high. So that's going to have its own implications for, how much Europeans are paying for their energy. So I would say, and then here's another interesting, I think, thing to maybe add into the mix. And this is, you've seen this, you heard this at COP29, and you're hearing it coming out of that places like the United States, we've been able to develop with a full energy portfolio at our disposal, right? If you just look at it that way. And other countries now are feel in some ways shackled. They feel less independent to develop their energy sources, especially hydrocarbons, because you had many Western banks that said that they would not fund hydrocarbon projects because of their own sort of ESG or kind of divestment practices. So that's been a really interesting kind of dynamic that's been at play. And you have found some Ted Nordhaus has written some interesting things about that, and looking at energy growth and the need for access, kind of agnostic access, while, to see economic growth.
Okay, questions from general audience, put it in the chat box. I have one from Samantha Fox, Carolyn. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the use of green and blue hydrogen and its use in Germany to power green industries.
Oh, the rainbow of hydrogen, right? I'm sure there are many people on this call who probably can speak very in-depthly about hydrogen. So I don't claim to be a hydrogen expert. I think one of the big things is blue hydrogen is just, it's a little bit easier, but it's also comes with the negative externalities of, more carbon and methane emissions. Green hydrogen, again, I think one of the things, again, I go back to a seminar that I participated in at MIT about green hydrogen. Now this was a few years ago, so clearly things have changed, but this idea that why are we going to use wind and solar that we could be using to build into putting more into, the electrons for electricity production, and use that there rather than using it to develop green hydrogen. And that said, I think, and here's I think an interesting, again, kind of question, which again, I think there are many more experts on this that can speak to this, is the IRA was a game changer for hydrogen in the United States. If you had not had the IRA, we probably wouldn't be having a conversation about hydrogen in the United States. But the support, the funding, the hydrogen hubs kind of created this hydrogen ecosystem, a system that we could sort of think about how the United States builds out hydrogen in its energy system. If that funding is taken away, if you see fewer supports, again, people that I talk to think hydrogen is a much tougher sell, and the costs are hard, and the economics of this are really hard. So I think you've seen both here in the United States, I would say it's especially true in Europe, is that you've seen a little bit of a deflation of around the optimism for hydrogen. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but my sense is that some of that high level of optimism about, where hydrogen could go and how it could be added to the mix and how it could be part. And again, I think this gets to another aspect of the impetus for the piece that I wrote with Haas, is that again, you go back there was a lot of enthusiasm for hydrogen, a lot of sense that this was going to be an important part of the energy transition. It's proving to be less so. It's not going to sort of take the role that some people believe that it could. And so you take that away, you don't have that hydrogen piece that's helping to spur the transition or helping to be part of that transition. So in the absence of it, so I was in Japan in 2015. And now again, in 2015, no, it was 2016. And I had a group of students from NYU, and we were looking at Japan 5 years after Fukushima, right? This was when Japan still had a very challenged relationship with nuclear power. You still had significant public discontent and animosity and against bringing nuclear back online. Hydrogen was very much like a big part of the discussion and what Japan was going to be doing to be a hydrogen leader. In fact, the Tokyo Olympics that were supposed to happen in 2020 were going to be kind of like really unveiling Japan as a hydrogen superpower. We haven't quite seen that. But what we have seen is because of geopolitical insecurity, because of energy insecurity, you've seen a very oppositional public to nuclear power actually start to move back towards wanting nuclear power. And part of that is to, address energy insecurity and also to address, price insecurity. So you've seen a shift in the public discourse, which has sort of led to the government being able to reopen some of those nuclear power plants that were closed immediately following Fukushima. So I didn't answer directly your question about hydrogen, only to say that I do think it's been a little bit of the bubble bursting on hydrogen.
Well, Carolyn, the incoming administration has a kind of similar view on hydrogen. So um, here's a question from Suzanne Glatz. What are your thoughts about geothermal as a possible path to reducing the demand for electricity and still contribute to energy security and support growth and demand? And
Yeah,
I suppose, Suzanne, you also include deep geothermals that is yet to be exploited.
Yeah, Suzanne, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, no, I think geothermal is really interesting. I think if you go, I mean, Texas is kind of a great example of the state that kind of does everything, even though it's like how to talk about climate without saying climate, because they don't like to say climate. But yet you see large deployments of wind, you see large deployments of solar, you see they'll do anything if they see that there's economic viability for it. They may not put it under the umbrella of climate, but it ultimately sort of helps in the overall, emissions portfolio. And on geothermal, you are seeing like Fervo Energy, which is a company. You are seeing, I think, you're also, which is a really interesting place where you're seeing the technology that is used for drilling, like oil and gas, can be this idea of like transfer of technology and transfer of the skills and transfer of the workforce. So it's not necessarily having to completely reskill the workforce, but it's to sort of transfer the workforce from hydrocarbon drilling to geothermal. So I think you're going to see much more of that. We just have a new geothermal building here in New York. So I think you're going to see geothermal. And I think so. If you look at the United States' new Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, he's a big supporter of geothermal. So I think you're going to see, at least in the United States, more support for the research and technology around geothermal. And I, here's where it gets really interesting, right? If you were looking at forecasts for where I sit here in New York, right? And I was in many discussions in the have to go back. I ran a program maybe in 2018 on offshore wind. This was when New York State had issued approvals for offshore wind in New York State. We had approved 9 gigawatts of offshore wind in New York. New York was going to be the leader of the Northeast for offshore wind. Does anyone know how much offshore wind New York has right now?
Zero.
Zero.
0. And we don't anticipate that we'll be seeing any of that offshore wind anytime soon. So in some ways, so if you think about some of those forecasts, and this is where, again, this idea of the coexistence, the ideal scenario was that we were going to have these 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. We were going to kind of get through all the hurdles that confronted New York. We didn't have the ports that had the depth. We have the Jones Act, which is, I'm in a respectable audience. I won't use an expletive. It's a very outdated law, but nonetheless, it was going to really create a hard to manage situation to bring in large offshore wind turbines on U.S. ships that didn't have the capacity. So many things, right? And this was even before Trump came in and said that he was, basically anti-wind. So again, New York, which was expecting to have offshore wind, which was going to be a source of clean power and reduce New York's emissions, we're not going to have it. And very questionable if we will have it in the next 10 years. So what's going to make up that shortfall of energy that we were supposed to get from offshore wind? We are building the Champlain Hudson Power Express, which is going to take more hydropower from Quebec until Quebec decides that they need that hydropower, more of it. And so what you're seeing is New York is actually using more natural gas because we also closed Indian Point nuclear power plant. So that's where, again, I just want to kind of it's like one of the big kind of points that I'm kind of trying to get to is that some of those expectations, those targets, ambitious targets that have been set have been disrupted. And some of those have been disrupted because of economics. Some of them have been disrupted by shifting politics. Some of those have been disrupted by New York is a generally, we're very open to increasing the amount of renewable energy that we have in our system. However, there are certain things that have gotten in the way for us meeting those ambitious targets. And I think it's really interesting as upstate New York looks at data center and what New York wants to do to be more competitive to attract companies to build a data center, that what its energy portfolio looks like is going to be really, really important. So
Questions for Carolyn? Please.
Yeah. I have a comment. This is Jim Daly.
Sorry. Who's speaking?
Jim Daly.
Oh, Jim. Go ahead.
With respect to economics, the Energy Information Agency, in a cost of generation report about 4 years ago, cited offshore wind as the most costly producer of electricity, even more so than nuclear. And the reason that we're bringing coal back on is because as we add these data centers to the grid, they become a part of the base load, not variable load that varies during the course of a day. So it becomes necessary for interim to reignite the gas plants, the coal plants, but also to start looking at perhaps combined cycle gas plants as part of the base, base generation profile.
100%, Jim. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Yeah, no, that was a great, I really appreciate you sharing that. That's exactly what we're seeing happen, right? We're seeing that, yeah, you had inflationary pressures even kind of before some of the inflationary pressures, right? As you pointed out in terms of the economics of offshore wind. But then you're seeing, that need for reliable, resilient baseload power, right, is, combined cycle natural gas plants, coal-fired power plants, right? These, some of this, energy generation that was not expected to be either brought back online or to be increased. We're now sort of seeing a kind of an upending in those kinds of places. And part of it is, yes, it's the data centers, it's, higher demand for overall electricity. So yeah, no, I think it's fascinating, right? Like from a purely, yeah. So I just agree with you. Yeah, there's nothing, I mean, I appreciate your, what you just shared.
Okay, there was a couple of student questions. I think it was Andy. Andy, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, so my name is Andy Chung. I'm a current ESE student. I really appreciate your seminar. I just wanted to ask, what's your thoughts on like utilization of like dynamic price signals, like time of use pricing, to address the energy addition situation that you've been talking about early on?
Yeah, such great. I mean, I think that's such a fascinating area in terms of what we're seeing for kind of, yeah, that dynamic pricing that we can sort of like much more things that we couldn't do or didn't do in the past that we can kind of do today. Part of that is with the new models and how we can sort of much better sort of curate and understanding the demand picture on any given day. And even with new, more advanced weather models, right? We can, I think with AI as well, I think that that's going to be a new kind of dynamic in the overall picture to say, what does it mean for where things come in at what times of the day, and how you can, also on the demand side, kind of push people to to do things that put a lot of demand on the system, but do things at different times of the day. So yeah, no, I think that whole, that dynamic pricing system is one that is super interesting. Andy, I would say, which is really, and again, this is not like an area that I'm necessarily an expert in, but you are seeing across the utility space, right? You're seeing just a lot of innovation around how they sort of think about pricing and how they think about their planning models, and how they can also you know incentivize, right? Because they have their own sort of targets for bringing on more renewable energy, and at the same time, ensuring that there are not disruptions to the system, right? That it's 24/7, 365 days a year. So I think that's a really interesting space that you're going to see a lot of disruption in.
Sajjad, you had a question, a student?
Yes. Hi, my name is Sajjad Al-Shemari. I'm a student in ESE. Thanks for your seminar. Just only I have a question. If the OPEC stop producing like 70s, what will happen to the price to the world, or what will be increase, the wind turbine or the nuclear generation? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sajjad. Well, if OPEC stopped producing, so OPEC produces about 32 million barrels a day, Saudi being the largest producer within OPEC. That's OPEC. Now, if we include OPEC Plus, which includes Russia and Kazakhstan and Mexico, then that number is higher. I don't anticipate that OPEC will stop producing, partially because if OPEC stops producing, you would have massive economic dislocation and disruptions to the countries that depend on those revenues, which, Sajjad, you bring me to another interesting kind of part of the coexistence, is that Saudi and Iraq and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and other countries that make up OPEC, they will diversify their economies, and they have to some degree, Iraq less, but they still depend quite a lot on revenues that they get from the sale of their hydrocarbons, specifically oil. So they're not looking to stop producing oil because it is so connected to their budgets. So it would be massively disruptive if suddenly Saudi Arabia was not producing oil, right? If tomorrow we woke up and we had a, let's say, an attack against a Saudi facility, or a cascade of attacks against Saudi facilities that would take oil from Saudi, let's just say 9 million barrels a day off the market, you would have a spike in the price. Depending on how deep the damage was or how long it would take to get that oil back online, you would probably see anything from, maybe a $10 uptick in the price of oil, give or take. It depends. Depends on how extensive the damage was. And listen, every time the price of oil goes up, if you're an importing country, if you're Japan, if even you're Nigeria, you're a member of OPEC, but you produce, you send your oil out to be refined, and then you import it back. So you're going to have costs there would be significant costs to economies. And some of the most vulnerable get hard hit with high energy prices. I should just add, because again, I shared it with my students last week as we had our first geopolitics of energy class of the new semester, is in 2024, do you know how much money Russia brought in from its hydrocarbon production? So I'm saying there's not a big incentive for countries that produce hydrocarbons, United States being one. We now have a president who's like, drill, baby, drill. There's no talk. And even under Biden, even with the IRA, he was not reducing oil and gas consumption. He was not reducing oil and gas production, right? He was increasing incentives for more renewable energy production and more energy infrastructure here in the United States, but he was not disincentivizing oil and gas production. Russia brought in over $100 billion last year in revenue from oil and gas sales, right? So OPEC is, they're too incentivized to continue producing. They would actually ideally like a higher price than what they have now, but hey, let's put it this way. So if we're talking now, we go to geopolitics, where we're sort of not just about coexistence. What did Mohammed bin Salman tell President Trump on Thursday in his phone call with him? Does anyone know how much Saudi pledged to invest in the United States?
It has something to do with hundreds of billions, and he was going after AI.
600 billion. Now, Saudi's sovereign wealth fund is about 650 billion. So it's not that it's going to say, here's a check for 600 billion, we're investing in the United States, but you will have these cooperative agreements, between the United States and Saudi that will, Saudi will buy more planes, they will buy more military equipment from the United States, and so on and so forth, and it will kind of have a big fiscal number next to what that's going to look like. But you're not going to see, that's what I'm saying. Iraq, if you were to take production out of Iraq and Iraq loses its revenue from oil, Iraq is on its knees. Like Iraq's economy, because it's highly dependent on revenues from oil. They don't have, so you have a number of countries that are in OPEC that are not diversified enough to sustain under a different energy system. That's part of the reason why I think it's where we really have a more challenged transition, because you're not really seeing countries feel incentivized to reduce their own production. And again, it starts here in the United States. We're not incentivized to reduce our production. And now we have a president who's very much beholden, I think, has very much sort of, decided to kind of, align quite closely with hydrocarbon producers. So I don't imagine that we'll see OPEC closing down production. But if you were to have a big disruption, or you were to see, for example, the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca have an attack, or some kind of accident were to happen, or you were to see Houthi rebels really go after tankers that were moving either LNG or oil, you would see a shift in the price upwards, again, depending on the extent of the damage, the extent of how long that could be in play. You would have a price spike. And then just to say, so to the US consumer, again, I always like to take my students back. If you go back to summer of 2022, okay? Yeah, summer of 2022. How much was the price of gasoline in the United States?
$4 for gallon.
Yeah, it was in some places like California, it was over $5 a gallon. What did Biden do in the summer of 22? What did he do in the summer of 2022?
Think with the Saudi Arabia make more production for
Yep.
oil.
Yep, 100%. He called Saudi. He said increase production. He said it was Putin's price. Putin was driving the price up in the United States because of, the war, which was creating, kind of a price spike. Saudi was kind of called to increase production. This is where it gets, Morgan Bazillion, who's at the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines, wrote a piece for the New York Times that summer called Necessary Hypocrisy. And he called it Necessary Hypocrisy because for the Biden administration, high oil prices are bad for politics, right? They're bad for not just the American consumer, but they're also very bad for the optics around the presidency. But Biden also had that summer launched the IRA. August of 2022, you had the Inflation Reduction Act. So you have a, massive climate legislation that the United States government is moving forward. So you have this, well, wait a second, you're asking for higher oil production and you're calling for ambitious climate legislation. How do the two, how do these two sort of, how do we make sense of this? And Morgan called it necessary hypocrisy, because the only way that the United States will have the sort of the political support for climate legislation is if Americans don't have to pay a really high price for their energy, especially gasoline. So it's a little bit of this kind of like dance that that's had. So hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, we got a few minutes, so got questions from the audience for Carolyn?
Yes, this is How Long. Wonderful talk about the practical aspects of what's going on. How do you see this affecting our ability to reach 2025 zero carbon? It looks like that's a target that's kind of evading us right now.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for that question. 100%. Unfortunately, I think that idea of, what you're also seeing, and this is really interesting, you're seeing all of the major financial institutions, JP Morgan, Citigroup, BlackRock, they've all recently exited the Net Zero Alliance. I think there is a kind of a reckoning with the fact that these net zero targets are not going to be met. So rather than sort of get too close to when they're supposed to be met, these institutions, these large financial institutions are kind of retreating in advance. And I think we're seeing that here in New York again. I can't go into details, but there was a big meeting last week where New York is just probably not going to meet its carbon emission reduction targets. We're supposed to do it on the building side. We're supposed to reduce emissions through Local Law 97. We're supposed to do it through, again, bringing offshore wind, all these other, new energies that are supposed to be much, much less carbon intensive. Again, example of offshore wind, we're not seeing that on the side of who's going to pay for the retrofits. I'll give you a really funny example. Okay, this is a kind of a little interesting example. So not an insignificant utility here in New York, there's, drive for electrification, right? And electrification in terms of reducing emissions in buildings. So there was a kind of a package to help provide the economics and to pay for a good portion of the electrification of some of the residential buildings. And so they went into a building here, a very nice building, not far from where I'm sitting at NYU. And the building manager said, sure, we love the program. You can go ahead, do it. But there's one caveat. And they were like, well, what's the problem? If we can do it, let's just do it. You cannot drill a hole in anyone's apartment. And they're like, well, no, we can't do it then. Like, that's the whole portion. We got to go in. If we're going to electrify the building, we're going to have to make a few small changes. None of it is going to be disruptive over the long term. It's going to be short. The building said, absolutely no. Nope, you can't. And so you have this, as someone here in New York City said to me last year in a panel I was on, he said, all it would take is one, as he pointed out, the New York Post to have an older, he's like a grandmother on the front page of the New York Post who can't pay her rent because the rent has gone up because of Local Law 97. He said, and then that's it. That gets destroyed. And so it's these like things that people are like, you know, it's like on paper, this is the way it should have gone. People should have been like, yes, we want that. We want to see reduced emissions. We want cleaner air. We want all these things, but we don't want you to drill a hole. You know, we don't want to pay higher prices. And so I think you really are at that it's a very challenging point. It's, you know, a friend of mine who writes for The Economist, he called it bananas for infrastructure build. He's like, build absolutely nothing anywhere, nowhere, anyhow, right? It's like, and so in the United States, we've gotten so infrastructure oppositional, right? Where we 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 need to build much more resilient infrastructure because of climate. We're seeing it. There's no part of the country that's not going to see the impacts of more extremes. But and we need to build in more renewable energy, like we need, but getting that, like, and there's so much like brilliance, I'm sure, amongst all of you. You have technologies, you have things, you have ways to get closer to doing the things that we need to do to reduce the emissions. And it's just like you're just up against a wall, like, for a lot of things. And that's where, you know, I think that's kind of where, like, again, these were many conversations I had with Haas about this. And it's like, you know, I started the Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab because, you know, like, really like bringing home these ideas. And the last couple of years have been a little bit of my own reckoning with, you know, how do we kind of get to a place that is, we can have these hard conversations, but that I'm also not sort of selling my students a story that is actually not in fact happening. You know, that we're not sort of seeing this dramatic reduction in hydrocarbons. We're not seeing this phase out that, you know, countries pledged in Dubai in 2028 at COP28. And so and now we have data centers, right? And so even the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsofts, which, to your point about net zero, like, they're all walking slightly retreating from their net zero ambitions because they're seeing their carbon emissions go up. And part of that is also being driven by, you know, again, lots of very smart people on this call that, you know, you can't do the kind of compute power on low energy. So as you sort of see this, you know, demand for, and now you're putting AI and national security, like, you know, that the United States, even though, as someone said to me today, it's like the China's Trojan horse, right? Being able to do this much cheaper with $6 million versus billions of dollars. That's a game changer, right? So, but it's still going to require a hell of a lot of energy. And
But
so,
won't there be a day of reckoning down the road somewhere? I mean, right?
well, Hal, I'd love to, what do you mean by reckoning? I don't disagree with you.
Yeah. I mean, eventually we're going to have to come to some grips with the climate, you know, eventually. So,
I
but
agree with
like
you.
we're kicking the can down the road.
Oh, well, so, and that I think is the reality. And again, maybe that's
Yeah.
where, like, how do we get to a place where people are willing to kind of like
Yeah.
make the sacrifice, pay the higher price? In some ways, our politics don't help the situation, because once it gets to a higher price, politicians get scared and then they start to retreat, and then they like start to in effect change the narrative. So you know, I think we could argue that we've already had a multitude of triggers. And if we were to go back 20 years ago and say, you know, it's going to be a trigger moment that's going to get people on board, people are going to realize you could probably name 10 things, 20 things that have happened in the last 5 years that should have been triggers, you know, that should have been those things that like jolt us into confronting, reckoning with our realities, because those realities are not going to change. So I don't really know. That's not, yeah.
Okay. But thank you for your
Uh,
talk. It's really interesting, and it's the reality of what it is today, and somehow we have to work all through this somehow. So thank you very much.
You know,
Yeah, on
maybe
that
you're
note,
going to get to net zero. Maybe what you're going to get is some cost-effective resolutions that reduce our carbon footprint, that reduce our emissions, but do not reduce our lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. So to move away from like maybe the net zero terminology to carbon management, carbon reduction management, and that make that really the focus. And then, you've even seen that across the hydrocarbon space where you have, even though we're producing more fossil energy, our emissions from energy production has actually fallen in the United States. So as we see overall, countries be able to reduce emissions, maybe not get 100% to net zero, but you're seeing the decreases in emissions overall and hey, I did not go into what I consider to be potential game changers. And I do think there are potential game changers here with China's deployment of solar panels and EVs that they can sell to emerging markets. They can leapfrog, right? They can go. So there are possibilities for some pretty significant disruptions. I don't discount those. So, to be further discussed.
okay. On that note, thank you very much, Carolyn.
Thank you.
We have kind of extended our time to almost 5 minutes after, the closing bell. Excellent talk. I think thank you for handling so many questions, giving us so much perspective, and look forward to kind of having you present at a later time, hopefully with some interesting game changers.
Thank you. I really
All
appreciate it.
right.
Thank you all so much for your time today. Everyone, take
All
care.
right. So 2 weeks from now, we'll have a presentation on the energy transition and finance, February 10th, Paul Browning. So hopefully we'll see all of you there, and have a great day. And thank you again, Carolyn.
Thank you very much. Bye. Everyone, take care. Bye.
Goodbye.